It's hard to keep a secret, especially in the digital age. Experts are around every corner of the internet, and there's thousands of people willing to rip apart work to see every single inch of what it's made of. Just because it's hard, though, doesn't mean it's impossible. Released in 2012, the presentation of Fez was one of a simple puzzle platformer. The orthographic camera presents the world as if it was 2D, but the reality of its 3D world meant that rotating the camera could reveal new platforms to find collectibles and explore its semi-open world. What the game was quick to reveal, however, is that it had a firm emphasis on the puzzle part of puzzle platformer. It had its own alphabet to uncover, maps that had to be deciphered to be understood, and I'm really hoping you took that spoiler warning seriously. Secret instructions in the guise of tetraminos, strewn across the world and hidden in plain sight. These puzzles, though requiring some effort, weren't overly complicated. Anyone could beat the game, and with a little bit of struggle, anyone could complete the game too. With the exception of these 3 secrets. Upon finding all of the game's 64 collectibles, the game's map still marked a few areas as incomplete. Inside of them were unique puzzles that didn't operate with the standard communication that the game had established. The first to be decoded was 2 flashing lights in the observatory. The left and right flashes corresponded to 0s and 1s, which when used as binary can be converted into this message. However, many people found this within the first day without properly solving the puzzle, since misinterpreting this as directly telling you left or right world rotations also contained the answer. The second was a riddle, with the answer implied by a group of owls that you might find throughout the world. This puzzle took substantially longer for a lot of people, but some were still posting the answer just one day after release. The last was one that seemed quick to solve. Earlier in the game you find a map that has a similar marking to the one in this room. On the back of the map were arrows and a code that players would use to be deciphering at this point. When the player followed those instructions, they would summon a large, floating, black monolith. And though it would seem they were about to see the game to its end, players at the time couldn't have known they were at the start of a puzzle that might never be solved. Oh, well, about that. When players first summoned the monolith, they knew they weren't at the end of the puzzle. Aside from the fact that the room was still marked on the map as unsolved, this square here indicates that there was a second part. Along with the game's own script, it had its own number system, with the square that you start the puzzle indicating 0, and the next square being able to represent anything from 1 to 4. But it probably meant 1. This, like the others, was discovered in the first day, and the theory crafting from that point would spread across multiple different forums. On GameFAQs, the big discussion that would end up being several hundred messages long opened with the title, "The key to the monolith must be the tome somehow." On one end of the map you find a tome with 8 walls of text on the right side of the page and 8 large letters on the left side of the page. 8 is a fairly important number in Fez since most of the secret instructions come in an 8-input sequence. Since a code was required to activate the monolith, it was likely a code would be needed to solve it, and the tome might be hiding that. While the language in Fez can directly map onto English, when attempting to convert the tome into its plain text, it was entirely gibberish. Since this was the only piece of text in the game that was like this, there was obviously some kind of hidden meaning behind the letters. Many speculated that it might have been some kind of cipher needed to be taken apart. Those who were familiar with ciphers took it upon themselves to figure it out, while others chose to scour the world for more direct clues. Players found that by going to certain areas of the map and entering first person, they'd be able to find strange squares that were unrelated to any previous puzzle. On top of that, people had found a section with 8 squares inside of it all the way down to just 1, with no repeats, which, assuming all of the other squares could be found, would make a typical 8 input length of a code. Considering the monolith also required you to go into first person to know that you were in the right spot, it wasn't too far flung to assume that these different sections of the map were related to the puzzle. However, despite their efforts, a big hurdle came in that nobody could seem to find the 4th set of squares, and though it might have seemed key, there also wasn't much to gain from being in the already found locations to begin with. Players also found very little to gain from the tome. One user says, From letter frequency analysis, we know that the letters are the right way up, and also that it's not a substitution cipher in the tome. Those letters are scrambled in some way, but they are definitely not enciphered by letter substitution. This certainly wouldn't leave the community with nowhere to turn, but most other ideas wouldn't gain much traction, and unlike the other puzzles where one stray user would share the answer in a matter of hours, a full day had passed at this point despite deliberate collaboration. A couple of users would question whether the puzzle was related to the game's unique number system, though thanks to how disconnected it seemed from the puzzle, they were never particularly popular. More niche ideas like this were in abundance, but before any of them could be investigated, a very different type of lead would enter the forums. I think I'm the first to get all 68 cubes. 2 days after the game released, a message from a user on NeoGAF would spur the community in a slightly different direction. Collecting all of the cubes, along with one prominent glitch, meant they had to have completed the monolith. When prodded about the solution though, the user wouldn't give much of a hint. Since they hadn't solved it, they'd been told the solution by a developer. It was that same connection to the developer that gave impact to what they said next. I don't think there are any in-game clues for it. Apparently, the fastest way to the solution is brute force. This set of sentences, while not forcing the hand of the community, would drastically reshape their focus. The most popular ideas were running up against dead ends. Nobody could find the fourth set of squares for those attempting to explore, and eventually when the tome was deciphered by sorting the pages in this specific order and then read three-dimensionally, it turned out to be a collection of haikus about the lore of the game. So, the community started to gather around brute forcing the solution. They took their assumption that it was some kind of 8-input sequence and put together massive Google Docs of almost every single combination of input, taken chunk by chunk. Despite how long it must have felt at the time, going through thousands and thousands of combinations, soon after they'd found what they would be looking for. On April 18th, a user would enter the Xbox Achievements forum and finally find the sequence to the monolith. The search was over, and that user was right. It turned out, it really was faster to brute force the solution rather than find the clues. Perhaps that wasn't all they were right about. Maybe there really were no clues to begin with. What surprised us the most is how the community brute forced the monolith puzzle. The way they got around to solving it was way more interesting and satisfying than we had originally intended for it. Despite the fact that the monolith had been solved, there was now a question that hung overhead, one that grew larger and larger as the puzzle was solved and days drew on. How was the monolith supposed to be solved? This interview with Phil Fish, the game's designer, at least heavily implies that it wasn't supposed to be brute forced, but even though this interview was from 2022, people had assumed that the answer wasn't in brute force even after the solution was found and none of the leads seemed related. The issue now is that anyone invested in the puzzle already would now be working with the knowledge of the solution. You might assume that this would make clues easier to find. After all, pre-existing clues and noise are normally given certainty when the solution is in front of you. But here the method of solving the puzzle emphasized a missing link as opposed to a point of uncertainty. What might have been useful was dismissed as useless before the answer had been found, leaving very little to speculate on, and revisiting those aspects, they still don't hold any value after knowing the solution. This inherent distance between the problem and the solution has created a bias in which it's almost impossible to not work backwards from the solution once you have it. When viewing the puzzle from this perspective, however, you aren't looking at it with the right frame of reference, and so anything that resembles the answer looks like a clue even if it doesn't add up from the other perspective. So, if you can't find the answer in the game, maybe the answer is outside of it. Fez released on Xbox Live Arcade on April the 13th of 2012. From this we get the release date 413-2012. The tome's page order is 15263748. The release date in the tome's page order becomes 4011322. Convert this into the Zoo counting system. When leaned on its side like a Tetramino code, we get this, and then if we read it backwards, it becomes this. If we think of the numbers as arrows, then this converts to something suspiciously similar to the Monolith code. This was a theory written by Faust Dogger that gained substantial attention. People had been searching for over a year at this point on and off, and not only does the release date add up, it doesn't seem too far-flung to assume that a game that plays around with some meta aspects would have at least one puzzle that requires some work from outside of the game's confines. It does, however, require some leaps in logic, specifically in that nothing about the room, the map that leads to the room, or the Black Monolith itself implies that you should look for a release date. Not to mention how this is a collection of steps that you would only possibly take if you'd already known the solution. Nobody was as aware of this as the person who posted it, who'd repeatedly been critical of their own idea, even attempting to reiterate that this might only be one possible solution. Even still, without any word from the developer, this seemed very likely to be the intended solution, given the specificity of the numbers, along with the fact that this was the only sequence in the game that required 7 inputs specifically. There were still theories that would pop up here and there, but for many, the search for answers would stop here. 6 years later though, there would be an unusually clear point of communication from the developers. A popular theory for the solution to the Black Monolith puzzle is that the game's release date on Xbox is a part of the solution. Sadly, it does not add up. This was posted by Renewed Bedard, Fez's lead programmer, to the game's subreddit. Perhaps in order to not interfere with the discovery process, they'd let the theory sit for a while, but with this clarification we could rule out that, at the very least, the solution wasn't time-related. The Black Monolith was not added to the game in a post-release patch, and it was not added to the game last minute. To be 100% clear, we had no knowledge of the exact launch date when adding the Black Monolith to the game. This was a very unusual case of circumstance, but that's all it was. Given the unusual clarity from the developer, I think it's fair to speculate that this also implies there's still an intended solution that hasn't been found. With Bedard and Fish's understandable stance on keeping it a mystery, we will likely never have confirmation of what the solution truly is, but this at least implies that if someone was to find the answer, it would more naturally slot into place. Once the game was data mined, people could also discount the idea that there was some kind of missing piece. There were files that nobody had ever seen before, but they were all unused files, and some of those unused files even pointed towards the idea that the Black Monolith might have been redesigned midway through development, also reaffirming that this puzzle had existed long before the release date would have been known. With the way that Fez operates, there's nothing to say that the code isn't in an already existing asset that we've already seen. Because the gap between the problem and the solution is one of the player's own knowledge, rather than a state or a trigger, data mining the game wouldn't reveal where that knowledge was supposed to be acquired, or even if that knowledge was in the game to begin with. If there is anything in the game, chances are we already have all of the pieces. It's just that nobody has put them together in just the right way. One of the theories that gained some traction was around the use of the lead designer's name. Phil Fish is a kind of pseudonym for Philippe Poisson, and based on the amount of unique letters in the name and unique inputs in both codes to the puzzle, you could, in theory, map them onto each other. This has led some to believe that the name might be key to discovering the answer. The issues this runs up against, though, are numerous. Ordering the letters of the name to align with the sequences in the code would be entirely arbitrary, and to ascribe any of the single-use letters to any particular input is equally random. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that these two inputs might be some kind of hidden signature built from the name. However, to imply that it's something key to understand in order to get to the solution, I find that hard to believe. There are many theories just like this one, the main issue being that they're working backwards from the solution, and also that they're tangential to the problem put in front of you. If you look at the other puzzles, they're fairly isolated once you know what you're looking for. The observatory puzzle requires an understanding of binary, but with pen and paper and a little bit of understanding could be solved. Whether or not the code itself was some kind of Easter egg would be unrelated to the solution itself. The security question puzzle does require some hints from when you first speak to the owls, but it's also clearly a riddle with a direct knowledge-derived solution. There are a lot of proposed solutions that are mainly just pieces that align with the answer, not ways to get the answer. An interesting observation is that the pairs of candles in the room also match the length and frequency of the solution, but only when certain pairs are removed, on top of once again requiring the answer to derive any meaning from what's in the room. It is just another case of circumstance. Aspects of the game that seem more intentional run into issues so fast that it's hard to not assume that they're red herrings. The fourth set of squares in the world was eventually found, but it was inside of one of the only rooms in the game where first person is disabled, so there's no way to view the squares organically. This would lead to the remaining 7 set of squares being just the right length for the sequence if they revealed anything. People have wrapped their heads around these for a while, but as you can tell by the amount of time that's passed, nobody has found anything close to a hint, and I'd suspect there's nothing to be gained. A particular fascination for many is the boiler room. Inside are assortments of paper much like the maps that you pick up, and the map that's used in the first half of the Monolith puzzle is burned at one corner, with this potentially being where those maps were made, and this being one of the only places in the game with an implication of fire. It would make sense that in the room where the map was written, we might get a hint at the answer, and in that same room there's a curiosity that might help. On the wall is one of the faces of the game's hexahedron, the thing that bestows the power to turn the perspective of the world. It's also found in a different portion of the world, implying some kind of importance. A user on Reddit pointed out that when divided into a 7x7 grid, it becomes a collection of numbers. Already there's a sequence here that has all of the required inputs, so if there was something in the world that gave us this specific number sequence, it would align with the puzzle. But without that sequence and nothing else to go on, it should be considered a coincidence. Alternatively, within the grid, there are 3 rows and 4 columns that would align with the Monolith sequence. Across the wall next to the diagram is a skull with 3 eyes. Likely this is just a hint towards the lore of the game, however there's also an artifact that you collect that, unlike the others, seemingly has no purpose. If you take a slight leap in logic and use this as a mask, you can take the first column, repeat it, and reveal every other input. This reveals not just a valid total of unique inputs, but also the correct order for those unique inputs. The first input in the sequence could also be dropped or included, and it wouldn't affect the outcome. All you would need to do now is find out how this sequence is supposed to be translated into these specific inputs, which nothing implies. While this might look more convincing than the others, it still falls into the exact same traps. The logic still requires you to know the sequence in order to derive any meaning from what you've gained, all of which seems largely coincidental. The issue with all of these is that despite how much these resemble the solution, the practical steps from problem to solution leaves us no closer towards the logical intended destination. Knowing the solution might have gotten us to the end, but what we now lack is the right perspective. Over the years, countless amounts of speculation has come and gone about the Monolith. So long now that new theories seem more like deranged pointing at clouds rather than a logical tinkering at a puzzle box. Naturally, in the very long hunt for the solution, some are convinced that brute force was the only option all along. I, for one, don't believe this to be the case. Even excluding what Fish implied in 2022, Bedard's comments holds an implication that they weren't satisfied with how the search had ended, and the fact that any comment exists unprompted in the first place is curious. Surely you'd have no reason to keep up with new theories if players had found the intended solution through brute force. Combining that with the fact that there's a puzzle in the game with literally no indication of its own existence that can only be discovered through data mining, leads me to believe that this also wasn't supposed to be an infinite mystery. Simultaneously, while I'd like to imagine that anyone might find the clues any day now, it's just as reasonable to assume that they aren't in the game at all. Perhaps this was supposed to remain unsolved, and the developers would slowly trickle out clues on social media as part of an alternate reality game. But once the solution was found, there was no way of concluding the ARG in a satisfying way, and so it never began. It sounds a bit dull, but Phil did mention that players brute forcing it was much more satisfying than what they had originally intended. If brute force was more satisfying than a legitimately solvable puzzle that has stumped players for 12 years now, I find it hard to imagine that players banding together to slam their head at a problem was greater than what they had planned. There's even a YouTube channel that some believe Phil made with videos that could have been part of said ARG, but these videos were also posted after the solution was discovered, didn't offer much in the way of hints, and could just as likely be someone trying to hijack the mystery. That's just one possibility though, and with a more optimistic mindset, there's still plenty to speculate on. A lot of confusion surrounded the tome, and the fact that nobody has ever found a use for the letters on the left side of the page makes for an understandable curiosity. However, I don't think that a book that already hides one very elaborate secret is somehow still holding some kind of cipher beyond its haikus. While the skull artifact is an oddity, there's nothing to say that it has a use as a puzzle-solving item. Fez isn't just one big puzzle box exclusively for the monolith after all, so chances are this was just a lore item. A part of me wants to believe that discovering the secret is hardly related to anything but the map. Somewhere in the world we might find out how the first code was discovered, and then we need to repeat those steps somewhere else in the world to create the code in the burned part of the map. That's not really even an optimistic view though, and more a case of armchair game design. Nothing in the world implies that this is even possible. Even still, the diagram of the hexahedron does seem suspiciously convenient to not be connected to any puzzle, and there might be other elements in the game like it that nobody has paid attention to. The only way we'll ever really know if the search should end is either someone coming to a clear, repeatable answer without the perspective of the solution, or if one of the developers finally pulls back the curtain to stop the search. Which one comes first? Or if any happen at all? Only time will tell.